Historicism was the primary method of the Reformation, as the Reformation was building upon the interpreted knowledge left by the early Church Fathers, which was based upon the Bible's own method of interpreting itself. If any one reformer seemed to get it more right than any other, it's only by God's blessing that they had seen farther by standing on the shoulders of giants, and history had progressed enough to clearly see a progression of nations. However, one of the largest failures of the reformers was that their followers did not follow the reformers' lead. They didn't continue to explore the scriptures and find further truth. Most followers enshrined the reformers' belief and started a new denomination. It wasn't until the 1800s that we see the last vestiges of paganism and philosophy questioned, but by no means was all truth revealed. Preterism and futurism were developed by the Catholic Church to counter the Reformation, and both basically state that for the first 1500 plus years of Christianity, no one got it right. Everyone was wrong. And while the reformers weren't always in agreement, and thus someone must be wrong, and they didn't always agree on the interpretation of certain symbols, they did agree on the historicist view of rise and fall of nations. I've read of gatherings where they incessantly argued over which 10 Germanic tribes had inherited Western Europe. But there are certain biblical interpretation that they did agree upon, one of the largest being context, historical, cultural, and linguistical, and that the Bible will never contradict itself doctrinally, if people would just continue to search their Bibles for themselves. Historicism agrees that the metals in Daniel 2 must be kingdoms, and then in Daniel 7 and 8, when we see symbols further unfold, we see beasts and horns as kingdom as well. The Bible defines its own symbols, as we see with the clay of Daniel 2 being referred to as potter's clay. There are more than a few instances in the Bible where God is referred to as the potter and his followers are as clay. But a whole Bible perspective is required to see these symbols, often grouping together in a scene or a parable, but not always. Once you start to pull these symbols together using the Bible as its own interpreter, preterism and futurism seem to really start falling apart, leaving only historicism as the best solution. Except that historicism seems to have a lot of issues of its own. Commentators just can't agree. As an example, some commentators see the seals and trumpets of Revelation in parallel, others in series. Some see certain seals and trumpets being fairly literal, others see them as wholly symbolic. As we explore the Bible and become comfortable with its symbols, certain passages in Revelation seem to jump out and scream that everything about it is symbolic. Some people will take an ultra-literal approach, where unless the immediate context defines the symbols, it must be literal. This does not allow the clay in Daniel 2 to be a symbol for God's followers, as Daniel 2 doesn't define the potter's clay as such. However, the broader Bible does permit us to see that when Daniel explicitly states potter's clay, we can easily assume that he had the symbol in mind. But should we? This is the realm of hermeneutics and exegesis. Hermeneutics being how to read the text, and exegesis is the explanation or natural conclusion that the text indicates. Bad hermeneutics will lead to bad exegesis, which is called eisegesis. If we were to assume that Daniel was written in 168 BC, and that there's nothing supernatural, or that Revelation was written before 70 AD so that we can place all the activities in the destruction of the temple, contrary to what has been taught for almost 2,000 years, or that the antichrist could not possibly be the Catholic Church, then we are creating bad hermeneutic principles for ourselves, principles that are going to limit the exegesis we can pull out of the text. Instead of creating principles to read the text, we have established an artificial conclusion that we try to read towards. We are reading into the text stuff that may not be there, i.e., eisegesis. So what are good hermeneutic principles? It appears that I need some broad principles that work for all the books of the Bible. I don't want to reduce everything to analogies and allegories like Origen did in the early 3rd century. Most of the Bible stories are literal, especially the historical stories. But on the flip side, I also don't want to be ultra-literal and take everything as literal unless the context explicitly demands it. Being ultra-literal can lead to problems with some of Christ's parables that were rhetorical, where there was no symbolic answer given. So I probably need a middle ground and examine some good hermeneutic principles and contrast them to bad hermeneutic principles.